All right, I want to talk more about how LLMs think. And we talked about it in the previous video. But in this case, I wanted to show how two different models tackle the same problem in different ways. So you'll find this as a developer, uh, and I'm sure this is going to be the same for just AI tools in general, that they will be geared towards certain scenarios. You can try, playing with personas and so forth, but in my world, it's all about development. So in that case, I gave two different models. In this case, it'll be GPT. I think it's four. Sorry, I'm using Olama just like I showed last time, where I can run these models locally. So I'm going to run like GPT-4, and I'm going to run DeepSeek, and just see how they take the same prompt about a programming question or programming whatever, and how they solve it. So in what you can probably see right now is DeepSeek right here, and you can choose from a whole bunch of different models, as you can see. But in this case, it's DeepSeek, and what I proposed was you are an experienced Microsoft and C Sharp developer. Write an example C Sharp function that adds two nullable integers together. This code will be pasted into a console application for use later. Now, in my head, and this is important, I want it to take the approach of a Microsoft developer. So, an LLM has been trained on so much information. Don't just throw problems at it, tell it its frame of mind so it has some sort of reference as to how to start on the problem. Otherwise, you'll get sometimes just the wrong result because it's looking at it the wrong way. Just like you wouldn't go, if you're talking with a let's say a junior engineer and you're an architect, you may not assume that they know all the patterns, but if you're talking to another architect, you're going to start using terminology and such with these assumptions. Well, LLMs can play any number of roles. They could be a junior developer, they could be an architect, they could be a neophyte, they could be a project manager, they could be anything. So you have to tell them what frame of mind to pose this question. So, that being said, I've given it what should be a somewhat simple problem. I want you to write a function that adds two nullable integers together, and then I want to paste it into a console application later on. Now, I've made some assumptions myself. Like in my head, I have already written some sort of shell application that I'm just going to. I'm expecting it to just write a function for me. I don't expect it to do all the pomp and circumstance of scaffolding out an entire console application. So let's take a look at what DeepSeek did. You'll see it thought for 22.5 seconds, and I always like looking at how it approached the problem. So in this case, it's saying, I'm not going to read it all because you can pause the video and read all this, but it figures out what it's going to do. We are going to write a function that takes two nullable integers, which is the int question mark, which is nullable int, and returns their sum as a nullable integer. We have to consider cases where one or both of the inputs are null. These are good things for it to think about. And then it steps through it. And you can pause the video and look at this stuff. Then it goes, hey, however, note that in C Sharp, if we try to add two nullable integers together and one of them is null, it'll throw an exception because you can't add an int and a null. Well, that's not true. That's not true. It'll actually return null. So, maybe DeepSeek was trained wrong, or maybe that was an issue with earlier versions of C Sharp. Or maybe it's just an issue with nullable. I don't think anyone does nullable int anymore. They just use int and then the nullable identifier, so int question mark, bool question mark, whatever, makes it nullable. So anyway, you can see how it thought, and then it gives you the plain English version of it. And you can see this is all the markdown. So here's a C sharp function, and you can see it has add nullable integers, which is a good name for it. It takes an int a and b, both of nullable type, and then it goes through and returns uh, well, it makes some assumptions. I actually I kind of like this implementation more than the next one I'm about to show you, because in this case it tries to always give me back the value. So if like A was 5 and B was null, in C sharp it would just return null. But if you just tried adding the two together, but in this it says like, look, if A has a value but B doesn't, then just return A's value. And same thing for B. Otherwise, if they're both null, return null. Okay, makes sense. But you can see how this was broken out. This is its opinion about how this problem should have been solved. Now, just like going to another developer, each developer may have a different approach. This approach is not wrong per se, because I was not clear in my instructions to the model. Hey, if they're both null or one of them is null, I want you to return null. In this case, it made the assumption I always want a value, which I think in many cases would be the case. You may disagree, but still, it's vague what I was asking for, even though to me it seemed obvious. The other thing that it did that I kind of didn't want, but I don't care about, is that it scaffolded. You can see it scaffolded the entire thing, um, but it's pretty cool. It did go and give me. Uh, it didn't write. Pardon me. It didn't write unit tests, but it gave me test output showing how to use the function and proving that it works. So that's fantastic. And then it explains to me the implementation details. I greatly enjoy that, uh, and you can use it in C sharp. Yay. Okay, now that was DeepSeek. Now let's take a look at what ChatGPT did. Or not ChatGPT. I'm sorry, the GPT model. Uh, so same prompt. In this case, it thought for about 4 seconds more than DeepSeek did. And you can see its reasoning is a little bit different. So it's still right. We need to write a C sharp function that adds two nullable integers. Provide an example with null handling. That's good. Should be in a console app, just like I said. Provide a code snippet. I didn't say to do that, but that's okay. And use the null identifier and null coalescing. Okay. And also maybe overload for null. Provide a demonstration. These are all good things that it's thinking about. In this case, it was named it add nullable instead of add nullable ints. I'll forgive that. That's fine. Okay, so here's what it's proposing. Should it return? Should it return 0? No, because the first check returns null. Okay, definitely look at this. Look at how it reasoned this out. So it says we can present two examples. Provide a simple console application with main, which is the entry function, demonstrating. So let's produce the final answer. And now it gives you the human readable breakdown, which is fantastic. Okay, that's what happens with all LLMs. So very useful. Now let's take a look. Whole bunch of comments. I do love comments. Yay, 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 yay. Comments. But look how simple this function is. It knows how C sharp works. So it says, hey, just return A plus B. Now, is that wrong? No, in the sense that I told it add two nullable integers together. I didn't say if they have values, return the value. I said add two nullable integers together, and it took that literally. There's like 20 lines of comments to effectively one line of code. So you can see return A plus B. So if A was 5 and B was null, this would return null. That could be confusing. Hopefully someone reads the documentation. I like what DeepSeek did a bit more because I would probably want that number, or I would want it to throw perhaps a null reference exception, that if there was no value, I would want to know that that was an issue. Um, but it depends. It depends on how you approach your problems. Everyone has their opinion, and here you can actually see so do the different models. And not every opinion is clearly wrong. In this case, they're both acceptable answers within the parameters of the prompt. So here you can see it shows how to use it. So it does still give me examples. You can pause the video and look at all this stuff later. Um, and then it explains how it works. It tells me about the nullable operator. Um, well, pardon me. The as you can see the addition operator is overloaded for nullable types. Uh, it explains how the return value works. It explains the testing, meaning the examples, and there's other options that you could start prompting it more like, oh wait, no, instead I want the values to come back, and perhaps it would come back with the same result as DeepSeek. So here's the thing that you need to consider, and I have found this to be very true. Different models are good for different things, and you're going to find that out. So, regardless of whether they think deeply or not, part of it is your prompt, part of it is your persona, part of it is what the LLM's training has been, and you'll have to make those decisions. So I've seen people have planning handled by one, code handled by another, code review handled by yet another, and then you know tests written by another, etc. As when you follow the planning pattern, and that's great. Especially when it comes to like your token usage. If you're using Claude, I use Copilot, and it seems to be vastly more affordable than Claude. Um, but that's for another rant. I was so surprised. Um, so keep that in mind. Play around with the same problems with different LLMs and find your LLM, your model of choice. I have found that I like to use Claude Opus for, I know it's expensive, but Claude Opus for writing documentation, because it just does a very good job of looking through everything, and its context window is so large that it can take a lot more into account. Quick things, I'll usually just, at least in Copilot, use Auto, and it'll use like GPT 5.2 or Haiku, uh, and Haiku's just so fast, and for like quick code, it does a really good job. But the problem is anything that requires like reviewing a specification or a lot of other related code, it just gets lost. It doesn't have that context window that can help it think. So, what have you found? Have you chosen a model of choice? Did this help you? I think this helps me better prompt as I see the different approaches. It's kind of like, if you have coworkers, you have to learn to work with your coworkers and interact with them in different ways, because everybody's a different person. And so, you just have to sometimes frame things differently depending on who you're talking to. It's just the way it is. And that's just human interaction. And LLMs, which are trained very much like human beings, uh, kind of the same way. So I hope you learned something today. I hope you found some value out of this. Please share this with others you might think would enjoy it. Like, subscribe, all that jazz, and see you next time. Thanks.